Hey, Alliance Northwest leaders, welcome to the inaugural launch for Uncharted, our leadership podcast for all of us in the Alliance Northwest. Hey, this month, as we are launching in December, I was thinking it would be really good to have a conversation about dealing with grief and loss in ministry, not only for ourselves, but for the people that we lead. There's a lot of emotions at play as we head into the holidays, so we are having a conversation today, and I'm really excited about this conversation. It was fun with counselor Lane Vander Sluis, great guy. So in the studio today, Elaine and I just had a conversation about grief and mourning, the difference between those, and why they're both necessary for us as leaders. So be listening in for how grief is a being and how mourning is the doing actions of working through our grief. Some other pieces I just really enjoyed with Elaine. He has some great insight as far as how do we navigate through this season when leaders are on point. It's a busy time of year. You're trying to get programs put together. You have services, and so much is happening that we often lose sight of tending our own souls. What I really liked hearing from Lane was that ministry is this mixture of not only the fun and joyous times, which the season brings, but also processing the loss that accompanies all of the joyfulness too. So he gives us some tools for processing that and making it a priority in our lives. So sit back, relax as we head into our interview with Lane Vander Sluis. Well, hey, we are here with Lane Vander Sluis, and we are heading into a conversation that I think is critically important, not only for leaders in the church, but for the people that they lead. We're going to be looking at grief and mourning, comfort and joy. And with Lane Vander Sluis helping me in this podcast, I'm very excited to welcome you into the room, Lane. Thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me.
So, Lane, maybe as we start, could you just give us a little background on you and what you do, why I might have invited you into the podcast to help us with this conversation today?
Right now my work and ministry is as a clinical psychologist, and over the years it's kind of evolved to really just working with the Christian community, the faith community as I call it. So my sense is if we're body, soul, and spirit, as a psychologist, I can only really help somebody who is aware of that and wants to nourish those things. So over time it's just moved into that category. So I get a lot of referrals from pastors and people from other churches, and also over the years seeing a lot of pastors and people in ministry and missionaries too. So one of the positives about being online is I get to meet with people all over the world now, so Indonesia or Philippines or whatever. So that's really expanded things, which is kind of exciting.
So you're saying pastors have problems too? Is this
occasionally, not a lot, but occasionally they do have problems.
Well, thank you again for being here. As we head into the holidays, this is a season that is full of a lot of emotion, a lot of fear, a lot of joy, a lot of pain, dealing with loss, or sometimes not dealing with anything, looking for ways to medicate around those. And so as we head into our conversation today, I'm hoping you can help us with some awareness of what is happening, not only in ourselves as leaders, but in those that we lead in our communities, things we should be aware of, looking for how do we process, what are some tips for those of us in leadership, maybe towards the end of our conversation together. But to start us off, there was a post on the news source of the world, Facebook, and it just noted the complexity of this season. It noted from this person's post all the things that they were dealing with, and so I want to read this first, Lane, and then we can jump in with some questions. But this person had just noted that this time of year, speaking of the holidays, is hard, all caps. It's hard and complicated, and I despise that it is so. So much grief and hurt and longing and anxiety and depression. Yet, so much to be thankful for. Humanity longing to embrace the divine. Missing the innocence of youth and simple pleasures. Missing childhood traditions. Missing who I was. Missing who my family was. Desperately craving joy, feeling wrecked but determined to preserve that innocence and joy and magic of the season for my children. Trying to do it in a place that's not our own. Every day's a battle. It's exhausting. I need the hope of the baby in the manger. I wanted to start with that just because it was so laden with story and emotion and pain and hope and remembrance. So as we head into this season, Lane, for leaders too, there's so much happening inside us that we're often not aware of. You want to let's start maybe there. What is going on inside us as we head into the holiday seasons that we should start to become a little more aware of?
Well, I think what she is alluding to are really what our journey is like. Because when she said, I long for that baby in the manger, that baby in the manger was described in Isaiah when he spoke of the man who is going to come who is acquainted with grief.
Yeah.
And that's part of our journey. And, when I look at that and then I look at the Beatitudes that talks about blessed are those who mourn, my understanding of grief is that it's an emotional reaction to loss. And mourning is how we process that loss. So if you figure grief is this thing we're carrying and you place it in a canoe, which would be mourning, you're heading towards that island of acceptance. And we need to have mourning because, Jesus said, blessed are those who mourn. And mourning is this process that's cleansing that leads us to that beatitude of being the person who is pure in spirit. When we're pure in spirit, we are cleansed. And so Jesus' walk was the walk of joy and happiness and peace, the fruit of the Spirit. But also, we have to have this concept of mourning as part of our walk. We walk with these two processes going on. We're looking for this place where there's joy and peace, which is the holidays. They're supposed to bring that, although, it never really quite lives up to its billing. But it's a great idea and thought and a place we want to get to where, family and community and consolation and all these things are happening. But we carry into these things grief, and if we have not processed grief, then it's even more difficult. If we're aware that mourning is a part of our walk and we're actively engaged in the mourning process, because there are many ways in which we engage in the mourning process. But if we just allow that grief to sit there, it becomes toxic waste in a way. But when we're mourning, we are processing grief. And, this whole year has been a very grievous year. But from day one of our birth, we start to encounter grief. Losses of all kinds, of opportunities, of jobs, of family members. And, that line in Isaiah struck me when I read it. It's like, I have been acquainted with grief because over the years I have just heard stories of people who have lost children and parents through accidents, through suicides, just horrendous ways. And this whole high tide of grief pours in. And then it's this process of, okay, now you have to start this mourning. And there's two kinds of grief. There is what I would call grief is like when my parents died, Well, they're in their 90s. You kind of expect it and you grieve and you mourn through it. But when you lose a child prematurely or through a suicide or some of these, then it's a complicated grief, because now it's not only grief, but it's also anger. It's anger as to why did they do that. And so, for a pastor with his congregation, there are people out there who are grieving the loss of a job, or grieving the loss of an opportunity, or grieving the loss of a marriage through divorce or estrangement from a child. But then when you have someone out there whose child has been killed through a drunk driving accident or whatever, now you've got people out there with complicated grief. And so their process of mourning is way more difficult than my mourning was when my parents died. Okay.
Yeah. So, so mourning, you said, is like the canoe. Mm-hmm. So mourning is the process of we're doing something versus grief is that state that we're in. So what as we head into these holidays, what are some of the things that we should be doing if we've identified loss? And you mentioned, loss of a job, loss of a dream, loss of hope. We deal with loss all the time, and then, as you said, there's more complicated. But if let's say as we're heading in this holiday, and we know it's going to be different because of one of those losses, what should I be doing in my canoe, my mourning canoe? How do I start navigating?
Well, there are many different kinds of canoes out there. I've been in homemade canoes that took a lot of skill to build, and I've been in some that were from Costco. They're all different kinds, but everybody's got to assemble a canoe. And when they do that and they're aware of this process, and there's many ways in which you can process mourning, but we're either going to do we want to look at individuals, what they can do, or should we look at pastors and perhaps what they want to be aware of?
So as we head into the season, what are some of the common warning signs that start showing up that there is some mourning and some processing that we should be about? Because I know once pastors hit this season, I know they care about their people, obviously, but it's a busy season. It's kind of like the two Super Bowls of the church year, right? You got your Christmas season, you have your Easter season. So a lot of us in ministry aren't paying attention. We're trying to get through things. What are some of the signs you see showing up in leaders' lives that should be indicative of giving us that little, hey, slow down, pay attention, look at me. We have some processing to do here before you lead someone. Or how do you do it during?
For pastors,
what
do they need to do?
Yeah.
Well, I think they need to recognize themselves. And, in our country, I hate to say this, but I think the church has embraced a lot of our culture, secular culture, in how we look at mourning or loss. We just kind of plug through it, get through to the other side. And, Paul said in, where was it, Corinthians or Galatians, somewhere, where he said, we weep with those who weep, right? Mm-hmm. And if a pastor, well, let me back up. Right now, my wife for the last 3 weeks has been gathering information from the grandkids and others of what they want for Christmas, right?
Right.
So when Christmas comes, she's not going, what do you want for Christmas? A pastor has to have his finger on the pulse of his congregation, of who's encountering some significant losses, so that when Christmas comes, he's not going, oh, I wonder who's really hurting out there. He's got to have an understanding. And then not just an understanding of loss of a loved one or something like that, but, loss of jobs and loss of opportunities and all these others. So, that's a lot of work, and it's not just for the pastor, it's for any leadership or anything like that people are aware as a community of who is encountering some significant losses. And then when you're looking at, the difference of a loss of a job, which creates grief and has to be processed, versus a child or a loved one. If if I lost my mother in a nursing home as she's dying and I got this plastic sheet that separates her from me, that's not just a normal loss. I mean, that's horrendous as far as I'm concerned. So now you're talking about what kind of world are we living in when we can't even hug someone who's dying, right? So it's gotten way more complicated, and a pastor has to be aware of how complicated it really is. And I think the distractions are all these programs we're doing and all this other stuff, but it's a real opportunity for a pastor, I think, to be aware throughout the year of what's going on, but also, I come from the Netherlands and I stay in touch with family members, and my cousin is deeply involved in her church, and she was mentioning the other day that they have a day of remembrance every year. And there they acknowledge losses. And I think most of the focus is on loved ones, because I lost a brother-in-law this year to COVID. I imagine a lot of people have lost loved ones in that context, but not just to acknowledge, you lost your husband or your wife or whatever it was to COVID, but it's also a place perhaps where people can be consoled. I mean, to have a setting where people who want to be able to express their grief, which is part of the whole thing of moving through this mourning, is being able to express it in so many ways. If they can sit there amongst maybe 40 people or 30 people, or have other groups where they can just talk about what kinds of things and how it's affected them, that's a huge part of what goes into that canoe, is to be able to express it, because ultimately you want to reach that place of acceptance. And if your child has committed suicide, it's a little harder to get to that island than my parent who died. But it's hard, too, for someone who couldn't even kiss their mother goodbye because of this plastic sheet, or they couldn't go in there and all that. So, I mean, it's become more complicated. But I think the role of the church is not just to encourage one another in our faith, but it's also to help people recognize and accept and verbalize what they're grieving about and be part of this process of mourning. Consoling is part of that process.
Yeah, I had 2 texts this week. I was responding late last night to one friend whose husband is in hospice and is really at the tail end, and it was the text asking for, what should I say? How do I make sure that he knows I love him? And there's that coaching there. And then I had recommended, one, it's a sacred moment, the passing, and then I heard back that she had COVID and he had COVID, so she doesn't get to be there. And it's like, oh, I tell you, my heart was breaking. It's hard enough when you get the tangible and the touch, like you said, but we have now had this season of a plastic sheet between us and visits through windows, and in some ways I feel that's the humanity's exited in light of that, and we have to help each other process that too. It's different. And so as we navigate those worlds, or don't, looking for a church to create space to you, how simple would that space be? Because I could hear some leaders going, I wouldn't know what to do to create a space for people just to unburden a little. How simple, or what could a structure like that look like for our leaders?
Well, I was thinking about that. I think every pastor should have some connections with counselors, whether psychologist or master's level or whatever it is. I mean, it's just necessary these days. Yeah. And there's no reason why a pastor couldn't source that out, in a sense. Yeah. To say, hey, can you help us create an atmosphere where people can express grief, can express how they're doing, how they're mourning, and maybe to encourage and pray for one another, and maybe make connections. The 2 people who've lost a spouse can go have coffee later on or something like that. So, but someone to kind of pull that together. It doesn't have to be fancy or anything. It just needs to be kind of created by someone who's done work in that area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's not all on that pastor, that leader.
Not at
Just
all, 'cause I
reach
think
out,
you'd have a
find
hard
someone.
Yeah.
I remember years ago, one of our support groups for grief during the holidays, I was we had been going, so we're in a circle by the fireplace, and this one guy comes in late, and you can tell that he's looking for our group, and he just walks up. He's a little gruff, and he goes, "Is this the I Hate Christmas group?" and like, yes, but that was his intro into starting, I guess, building his canoe. Right? He's okay. I just needed to get out of the house. I needed to share that I don't like this time of year because of the loss that he'd experienced in his life, and we had it was a good night. It wasn't. On my end, it wasn't too complicated.
Doesn't need to be.
But it was also just creating a safe entry point. Why do you think, in our world, you'd mentioned our churches tend to mirror our culture, which is, deny, avoid, medicate away from grief or mourning. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that tends to be something that the church doesn't generally want to deal with on the front end? Thoughts from you on that?
Yeah, I think it's partially the discomfort. We want the happy part of Christmas,
Mm-hmm.
but Jesus came into the world. I mean, this is the Jesus who was acquainted with grief. So he's offering us a way in which we can process the joy and the pain, because the pain is necessary for cleansing. If all I do is just celebrate Christmas, in a sense, what have I really gained? If I've had that opportunity to process, through mourning some things and being around others who've done that, I think it's more of a whole idea of what Christmas is. I think people hate Christmas because it's all jolly Saint Nick and all that kind of stuff. And it's not meant to be that, I don't think. It's meant to look at the whole thing of what Jesus came here to do. He does comfort us, and the church is to comfort one another. And this is a time when, if you're ever going to comfort somebody, Christmas should be a time where you're weeping together, where you're comforting each other. This morning we passed a Russian church, and they're going to have Christmas music, songs, and we're probably going to go to it because that's great. But if they said, there was also this time where we can count our losses and discuss those things, I'd like to be there because, my wife lost a brother. And I think she'd like to be able to process that with some people who are there who've had losses like that too. So I think for Christmas to be the whole thing, and maybe part of secular society is it's just become a little bit capitalistic about, Black Friday and Cyber Monday and, get out and buy stuff. And, it's so exciting. It's like, yes, it is that. But the whole thing is also the sad part. And, we worship youth in this culture. And we don't talk about death.
Yeah.
We don't talk about
death.
Because why? Why can we not? Death is just a gateway to eternal life. Why do we not even mention those things? So, the mourning is not just an individual process thing. It's part of the body of Christ. It's part of the body mourning with this person as part of the process. It is not meant to be done in just isolation. It's meant to be done as a corporate entity.
I think maybe that's why I've looking at the Easter season, one of the built-in, if the church observes it, it's built in. You have from the upper room to Good Friday, so and then you have Holy Saturday or the silent days, and so you're forced into that. But even there, everyone wants to get to resurrection, right? And so in the Christmas season, there's life and there's birth and there's hope, but there's still also darkness, in the land, and that we need hope and there's a reason why this hope exists. So I think when we miss that in our leadership too, that we're missing a great opportunity to reach people for Jesus.
Totally.
And we oftentimes, I think what you're saying is, we want the positive because that's what our culture likes, so that we go straight there. However, what our culture likes and what our culture needs often are two very different things. And what an opportunity to create space
It's
for
a
people to
need
process.
that I think needs to be met.
Yeah.
That there are a lot of people who want to, I think, create this canoe, but have no idea of what it is that gets us there. And I think it's not necessarily the pastor's role to do that, but people in ministry to help understand that the people out there need help. It's like, okay, you want to assemble your canoe? Here are some things you can do. And it's not rocket science or anything, knowing that each one is going to kind of mourn differently. But your goal is that you want to get to acceptance. Acceptance not only that it's happened, but acceptance of how it happened. That you're not going to get answers to why did they harm themselves, or why did that drunk driver crash into my son's car and kill him, and all that kind of stuff. There's some answers we're not going to get, and if we can't accept that, that toxic waste site turns into a lot of anger. And so it's people within the church community who are leaders can help the others learn that this is healthy, because in the end it produces that cleansing where we become, to be pure in heart, to be pure in our motives. How many people are really pure in their motives, right? That's what the whole point of this cleansing is about, is that our motives become less about gaining something because it really matures us, and in this cleansing we actually become more like Christ,
Which is the goal. That's good. So I have a quote I'm going to throw your way. Gerald Sitzer, he has a book on grief disguised, and it talks about this process and the soul in the process. I'm just interested in your thoughts, see where you want to go with this. Sitzer writes that the soul is elastic, like a balloon. Loss can enlarge its capacity for anger, depression, despair, and anguish, all natural and legitimate emotions whenever we experience loss. But once enlarged, the soul is also capable of experiencing greater joy, strength, peace, and love.
It becomes more genuine. When I work with people, frequently I lead them through kind of a visualization where they explore the 3 rooms in their mind. They explore their anger room, their loss room, and their fear room. And I tell them when it's all over, they've listed it out, and I've listed everything they've said, who they're still angry at. And some people have, cabinets worth of things they're angry at with people. Because I ask them to quantify. I say, okay, so, you typically list a brother and all these. But, for people who've been traumatized as kids or whatever, usually, there's uncles or whatever it is, all kinds of people in there. And then to quantify it, so, it can go anywhere from a piece of paper to a folder to a file drawer to a cabinet. And, these people who've experienced some significant losses, they're not talking about, a folder. They're talking about cabinets. And I remind them after it's done, I say, can you imagine if every morning you had to get up and strap a cabinet on your back, and that was your day? Well, you're carrying 12 cabinets emotionally. There's a book, The Body Keeps the Score. And, she talks about some of those things. But, when we carry all this, how can we feel joyful when we're carrying all this? The first time I went backpacking, we took like 6,000 pounds worth of stuff that we didn't need. And there wasn't much joy in that backpack trip, because getting there was just so much weight. My shoulders would kill me, and gradually I learned, less is more. And so now it's enjoyable, but that first time out, and that's what people are carrying. So when we explore the anger, then we explore their losses, And nobody ever says, nah, I got nothing in there. I lost my childhood. I lost my joy. I lost my identity. I mean, these are big time things that you're talking about. I lost an opportunity. But when you lose your identity or your childhood and you're 60 years old and you lost your childhood, that's grievous, right? And so then we go to the fear. What's your greatest fears? That I'll be alone, that I won't have anybody near me or whatever it is. So in the end, I tell them all these rooms are interconnected, because when you deal with one, you start to deal with the other. In a sense, by going through your anger and things like that, you're mourning, you're forgiving that drunk driver and all those kinds of things. So that whole process becomes one of getting to that place of acceptance. So I think it's really important that we realize we are elastic. I think God made us elastic, but if we don't stretch that through mourning, through processing grief like that, and gaining acceptance, we stay like, you ever try to blow up one of those balloons that will not expand? Yeah. I mean, you're sitting there, and you're stretching and the thing, but finally it starts to expand. And a lot of people are like that balloon. They are not expanding, and they need to be helped to just expand that out, because with that, you balance out that, I'm sad about this. I'll be sad about the loss of something the rest of my life. Sadness is okay. It proves I'm alive. If I wasn't sad about things, not just existentially about the world situation and all that, but sad about loss of a mother or all those kinds of things. But grief is beyond sadness. Grief is just hollow and painful. But through this mourning process, then you can accept, and that balloon starts to expand, and it can include those other things like joy and peace and love, kindness, other things like that.
What do you say to the person in this season that maybe is getting the courage to step into the pain or to step into the loss and maybe identify it, but they're afraid. They're afraid of what's on the other side, or even this quote talking about the soul is elastic, and that it has capacity, but they don't think they have it. For them to step into this role, and their questions tend to be more like, when will the pain be over? When will I feel better? When will God heal me? How do you respond to what it looks like as you process mourning and grief? What does it look like as the soul expands?
Well, I think if they can connect with someone who's been through the process, that's very helpful, because it is a journey that seems really complicated, because you're going into a dark place.
Yeah.
But if you can be around people, and that's where community is so important. If you can be around people, if a pastor can identify people who have been through the process of grief and mourning, and they've learned to manage it. When I talk about mourning, when I had my office, I point to my closet, say, what's behind this closet door? There's like 30 shoe boxes. Each one of those shoe boxes are something that I've had to process through. Loss of a child or whatever it is, they're all in there. And every now and then something will remind me that I've got a box just like that. And I will take it out and I'll process it and feel sad. And I may weep. And then I put the box back in there. So it's not in the basement, it's not in a U-Haul place or whatever. It's in my closet. I know it's there, and I'm not afraid of it because I've processed through it. So those boxes, we gather these boxes as we go through life. And that's where we have to, as a church community, is give people that opportunity to process this and get them in the shoe boxes so they can put them in their closet. And so to realize at times something will trigger. It's like, I can identify with that. But what I want to also do is to be able to share with someone else and say, this is a journey that is doable. That island is not out of reach. You can get there. And everybody's going to have a unique way. Yeah, some of it's the same. They have books on processing grief work handbooks and all that, and they're very useful to do with someone else. So some of these are uniquely yours, and others are, because we're all humans, it's not where we're going to have totally unique things, So some of these things are just that we can share. It's like, this worked for me, and this worked for me. To be able to go to the coast for one night and just lay before the Lord and journal and pray and write a lament. I mean, a lament is...
That's a whole nother conversation, right?
Yeah, it is,
lament,
but,
that's good.
I worked with a pastor in the Philippines who lost his wife while they were at some kind of conference. I mean, he says to her, hey, can you go get lunch? She doesn't come back. He goes and finds her. She's dead. Okay? He wasn't quite expecting that, right? So one of the things I was able to help him with is like, do you know what a lament is? He says, well, yeah. It's like, well, it's really quite simple. Kind of like Psalm 5, I think it is kind of a lament, where basically you set the stage by saying, God, you know all things, you're wonderful, you're the creator, so you're kind of setting him up, right? So you're setting him up like, you should know better. So you set it up with the first section. Then you say, why did you let my wife die? Why did you do this? And you just lay out your anger. Yeah. And then you by writing this all out in your lament, then you get to just this brief place of acceptance again, where the Spirit comes in to comfort, and you go, but you are God. You do know. And so acceptance is this place where you want to land permanently, but along the way of mourning, you just get glimpses of acceptance. You process this and you process this, and slowly you start to get there. And a lament is a great way to do that. And that's something you can teach at church, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, you don't need to write a book on how to, although I'm sure there are books on how to write a lament. But
3
basically,
steps to a perfect lament.
It's really a three-step process. And writing letters to people you've lost, or even a letter to the boss who fired you, I mean, you just want to process this. So as you do, you just start to regain life, but you become a balanced person. It's like anyone who denies they've been hurt is not really living life. I think they just need an avenue, a place where they can do this. And if you have people in the church who are willing to step up and minister to people like that, because there's plenty, and in a way, the older you are, the more you've experienced these things.
Yeah. Have you noticed any traits in people that lend towards more ease in dealing with grief or mourning compared to traits that you've seen people struggle more with it? Any camps in your years of observation you're going?
Well, I think a person who has really taken the time, who's had maybe assistance or worked through the process of mourning and landed on this place of acceptance, is changed. Okay. They're more mature. Oswald Chambers talks about people like that who don't have a show to put on. They're just they're just there, and they're approachable. They're not judging. They're not saying, it'll be better, don't worry about it. They're willing to listen and weep with you and all the rest of that, but they're there to help move you along. And those people, you recognize them kind of by instinct. They're not wearing T-shirts that say, I've processed this. They are people who are just more calm. They're not about showboating or anything like that. And those are the people that are just there in a loving kind of way. That and if you reach out and say, are there people out here who can help others, they'll show up.
Yeah, that's so good.
It's a gift that you can pass on.
Yeah. And I think those people are embedded in our churches. And so
they have to be.
On leadership, it's paying attention to those who have walked through it, and that could be their next ministry, that God has processed them. And so often when the pastor thinks she has to be the only person that helps everyone move through their grief and their mourning, you are denying the body the very reason we need the body of Christ, and that's to help each other grow. So paying attention, and like that, keep on the lookout, look for those who are in it right now and walk with them. It could be your best helper in the next season, as God has taken them through it too. So, as we kind of come to a wrap on this, I'm thinking of all of our leaders in the Alliance Northwest lane they're stepping in. This is the first week of Advent right now. Hanukkah's launched. Advent. We're into Advent. They're getting ready for the weeks ahead, planning their services, maybe dealing with it, maybe creating space. But from you to them, what would be the things that you would want them to know as they head into this season? Just some words of wisdom from Lane, saying as you head into this holiday season, as you're in week 1 of Advent, here's some things I would remind you of that I think are really important, not only for them, but for the people that they lead.
Well, a pastor is only going to help people when he's helped himself, right? Okay. So if a pastor's not taking time out, not just to read scripture and all that, but to meditate, to journal, to process, and even to spend a day is like, okay, what have I lost along the way? Where they can meditate on that and write some of those things down. And when they've looked at it and say, which of these things have I really processed and put in a shoebox, and which are still things that cause a lot of pain? So it's this self-awareness that, the blind can't lead the blind in a way. I mean, if they had taken the time and are taking the time to process, if I'm feeling these things and aware of these things, how do I help others? How do I communicate to them? How do I bring them out of the shadows so that they realize, yeah, I'm a man acquainted with grief. I'm a man who has mourned. I am in mourning. We're in a continual state of mourning because mourning is how we're cleansed to be real people. So this self-care is important. And obviously, we're a body, soul, and spirit. So physically, to enter into a time like this of more stress, to physically take time to rest and things like that, to observe a Sabbath rest. It doesn't have to be on Saturday or Sunday. It can be any other day. But I mean, to genuinely rest and not just catch up on work and things like that. But, the process, what for them, are they whole people? To realize I'm whole when I can balance between the joy of my salvation as well as the mourning and the grief I've accumulated along in this journey. Yeah. So I think those, to me, would be important.
Yeah, I agree. I think we lose sight of that. We call it the trichotomy, right? We're made in this trichotomy, and it's a oneness. It's a threeness and a oneness, like Trinity, right? Yeah. And if you are affected in any one of those areas, it affects the other. You see it. So if we are emotionally hurting, you see it in people's physical posture, and you also see it in their faith, in the spiritual side of them. And so as we step into this season, I'm hearing you say it's crucial that we are making Sabbath time consistent. And like you say, it can be whenever. Doesn't have to be on Saturday or Sunday, but pausing, reflecting. Would you recommend go through those 3 questions of what am I angry about? What have I lost? What am I afraid of? Is that a great place to start, even this season? Or
it is. If someone has not done that before, they might be overwhelmed when they open up those rooms. Yeah. If it's part of their normal self-nourishment to be self-aware of, unresolved anger, and not just anger at so-and-so, but, the anger at a loss that, they haven't processed yet. So depression is a word that covers loss as well as unresolved anger. Okay. So if someone's depressed, I ask them, so, who are you angry at? Well, then you look in their anger room, it's like, oh, no wonder you're depressed. But when we've lost someone or lost opportunities, that's a depression too. And so to be self-aware of the signs of depression, obviously, sleep issues or getting angrier faster or impatience or concentration, the typical signs that, a person's depressed, and being self-aware is like, wow, I've been really angry the last couple of weeks. What's going on? And it's only through taking time to process this yourself. You know, Jesus would go up into the hills all the time to pray.
Right.
Well, we think praying, you know, he's saying, Lord, please help. You know, he's meditating. You know, he's thinking about what's going on around him and the challenges and the pressures and all these kinds of things. So he's, you know, he's in conversation with his Father. So that's what we need to do too. And the distraction or the temptation this time of year is to get really busy, get a lot of stuff done, you know, get the kids up there singing and all that, trees up and all. But boy, if you're not taking time to make this a meaningful Christmas versus one that's just a whole bunch of activities, then I think you've lost out on something. So you have to really try to be aware of that temptation to, you know, to assume busyness is really productive. It's sitting around with other people who are processing losses and things like that. That to me is more meaningful than some of these other activities.
Sometimes the Charlie Brown Christmas tree is better.
Yeah.
than the full meal deal, right?
Yeah, right.
So today, Lane and I, to all of our leaders in the Alliance Northwest, Lane and I are giving you permission and freedom to pause and to reflect and to process in this season. And if your boards give you any problems, you can have them call Lane. Lane, what's your phone? But seriously, this is a time, I think, for all of us to say it's crucial to the mission that we have been given to make sure we are healthy, and that we are stopping, we are pausing, we are looking. And we're actually filling shoe boxes in a way. That's a great metaphor. I'm taking that one with me, Lane. I appreciate that. Before we sign off, any last thoughts from you you'd like to share?
I hope people, you know, pastors especially, I think they have a great opportunity to make their people more whole by looking at the side of their people who have lost things, people, opportunities along the way. Not just COVID related, but all the vast majority. And if they're aware of that throughout the year, then they'll be more prepared to find ways to help their people when they hit seasons like Christmas.
Yeah, so good. Well, Lane, thank you so much for being here today and being on our Uncharted podcast. This was valuable to me, so from us to you, thank you so much for your time.
You're so welcome.